What happens when an undercover CEO walks into their own business and realizes everything is falling apart? Elliot Warren thought his luxury hotel chain was thriving until he went undercover as a trainee and uncovered a toxic work environment, an abusive manager, and employees struggling just to get through the day. What he saw changed everything, and his next move shocked everyone. This is a story about power, injustice, and a CEO who refused to look the other way. Stay with us, because you won't believe how this undercover mission ends. Elliot Warren had built Warren Grand Hotels into a successful luxury chain, following in his late father's footsteps. With multiple locations across the country, Elliot had spent the past few years focused on expansion, relying on his management teams to handle day-to-day operations. However, despite promising financial reports, one of his flagship hotels in Miami had been receiving an increasing number of customer complaints. Guests reported long wait times, poor service, and visibly exhausted staff, yet the hotel's manager, Samantha, insisted that everything was under control. During a routine corporate meeting, one of his executives mentioned that staff shortages at the Miami hotel were becoming a problem, but Samantha dismissed concerns, blaming it on lazy employees who don't want to work. That comment stuck with Elliot. If there was one thing his father had taught him, it was that good businesses weren't built on excuses, they were built on leadership. Elliot decided that he couldn't rely on reports alone. He needed to see the reality of the hotel himself. But he knew that showing up as the CEO would just lead to rehearsed answers and forced hospitality. Instead, he would go undercover as a new trainee at the front desk. With a cheap uniform, a new haircut, and the alias Eli Walker, he would blend in as just another low-level employee. His goal was simple: find out what was really happening behind the polished corporate image. What he didn't expect was just how deep the problems ran, or how one manager's unchecked control was destroying the very foundation of the hotel. Elliot stepped into the Warren Grand Miami, a stunning high-rise hotel overlooking the ocean. The marble floors gleamed under the lobby's chandelier lighting, and the scent of fresh-cut flowers filled the air. To any guest, the hotel appeared luxurious and perfectly managed, but as Elliot stood near the front desk, the cracks in the operation became immediately obvious. The line for check-in stretched uncomfortably long, with frustrated guests shifting on their feet. A few VIP customers grumbled about slow service, while the phones behind the desk rang endlessly. Employees hurried between tasks, their smiles thin and forced, their movements frantic as they tried to juggle too many responsibilities at once. Despite the clear chaos, Samantha, the manager, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a frazzled front desk agent, Isla, was handling multiple guests at once, apologizing for delays while simultaneously answering phone calls and troubleshooting a reservation error. When she finally had a second to breathe, she glanced at Elliot. "You the new guy?" she asked, barely looking up as she typed. "Yeah, Ellie Walker, first day," Elliot replied, adjusting the cheap uniform he'd been given. Isla let out a small, exhausted sigh. "Good luck. No real training, just learn as you go." She waved him over and handed him a stack of manuals that looked outdated and barely relevant. Elliot noticed that no one seemed to have time to properly train him. He watched as Isla handled a difficult guest with patience, then immediately rushed off to prepare keycards for a last-minute check-in. She was clearly competent, but overworked and exhausted. That's when Samantha finally appeared, stepping out of her office for only a few seconds to glance at the mess unfolding in the lobby before turning around and walking away. Elliot felt a familiar sense of frustration bubbling up. He had seen poor management before, but never in one of his own hotels. He had come here expecting to confirm a suspicion, but instead he had already found his first undeniable truth. The Miami location wasn't understaffed because of lazy employees, it was suffering from neglect. Elliot quickly realized that he wasn't just in a chaotic workplace, he was stepping into a sinking ship. The employees were stretched thin, running on sheer willpower rather than proper support. As he fumbled through his first tasks at the front desk, he got to know the people keeping the hotel afloat. Isla, the front desk agent who had given him a rushed introduction, was clearly the backbone of the department. Even as she managed a steady stream of guests, she took time to help her coworkers, answer phone calls, and smooth over customer complaints. Her efficiency was impressive. but her exhaustion was undeniable. Elliot noticed how she rubbed her temples when she thought no one was looking, and how her shoulders tensed every time the phone rang again. Then there was Nina, a housekeeper and single mother who had been at the hotel for 3 years. Elliot first saw her pushing a heavy housekeeping cart down the hall, rushing between rooms while checking her phone. A moment later, Samantha's sharp voice cut through the air. "Nina, unless you're texting about hotel business, put that away, or I'll start cutting your hours again." Elliot watched as Nina's face flushed, her hands tightening around her phone before she quickly shoved it into her pocket. She didn't argue, just nodded and went back to work, but Elliot caught the way her jaw clenched and her eyes flickered with frustration. In the lobby, he met Marco, the concierge, a middle-aged man with a knowing look in his eyes. Marco had been with the hotel the longest and seemed to have seen it all. When Elliot asked him how long things had been this bad, Marco only shrugged. "It used to be different, but ever since Samantha took over, people either fall in line or get pushed out. Those of us still here, we've just learned to survive it." Elliot was starting to see a pattern. Employees weren't just struggling, they were being deliberately controlled. Samantha held total power over their schedules and job security, and anyone who spoke up or pushed back lost shifts, promotions, or even their jobs. By the end of his first shift, Elliot's frustration had turned into anger. The employees weren't failing, they were being set up to fail, and the worst part? The guests blamed the staff for slow service, not realizing they were running on fumes. As the evening rush slowed, Elliot took a deep breath. He had come undercover to see the truth, and now he had. The real question was, how deep did this go? And how long had Samantha been getting away with it? It didn't take long for Elliot to see just how deep the mismanagement ran. Every part of the hotel was struggling, not because of the employees, but because of how they were being treated. He noticed that many of the front desk staff were working back-to-back shifts, barely getting a break, while the housekeeping team was constantly behind schedule due to ridiculous staff cuts. One of the most glaring issues was the way Samantha controlled employees through their hours. If someone questioned her decisions, spoke up about unfair treatment, or showed any frustration, their hours would mysteriously get cut. Elliot overheard multiple conversations where employees whispered about how they needed extra hours but were too afraid to ask. He saw it firsthand when Nina, the housekeeper, hesitated before clocking out. Samantha had forced her to take an extra long lunch break, then told her she had run out of hours for the day. Elliot watched as Nina checked her phone nervously, probably calculating whether she could afford groceries that week. Even worse, Samantha played favorites, giving easier shifts and bonuses to employees who stayed quiet and followed orders, while punishing those who questioned her authority. Isla, who was one of the hardest workers Elliot had seen, was given back-to-back shifts with no breaks, while another front desk agent, who barely put in effort, was allowed to leave early whenever he wanted. It wasn't just about control, it was deliberate exploitation. In the kitchen, the skeleton crew of cooks was overwhelmed, trying to keep up with room service orders for an entire floor with only 2 people. When Elliot asked why there weren't more staff, one of the cooks, Lewis, muttered, "Samantha says we can't afford it, but she sure doesn't cut her own hours short." Then came the final straw. A bellhop slipped while carrying heavy luggage, alone, twisting his ankle badly. When someone suggested filing an incident report, Samantha rolled her eyes and said it was his own fault for being clumsy. Instead of sending him home, she told him to walk it off and get back to work. Elliot clenched his fists. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was a calculated system designed to keep employees powerless. Samantha didn't just ignore problems, she created them. By the end of the night, Elliot knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about a lack of good workers. This was about a bad leader who had been left unchecked for far too long. By the 3rd day, Elliot had seen enough. He had watched employees break their backs, trying to keep the hotel running with barely any support, while Samantha sat comfortably in her office, emerging only to bark orders or reprimand someone publicly. It was time to push her buttons, to see how she handled confrontation from someone she thought was just another powerless employee. During the evening rush, the front desk was slammed. Guests were frustrated with long check-ins, the phones were ringing non-stop, and Elliot was doing his best to juggle reservations and room requests. Isla was moving at lightning speed, trying to pick up the slack, but it was obvious that they needed more hands on deck. Samantha, of course, was nowhere to be seen. Elliot spotted her through the glass office door, scrolling on her phone, sipping a coffee, completely oblivious to the chaos outside. That was the last straw. He marched up to the office and knocked sharply. Samantha barely glanced up before sighing dramatically. "What?" she said, clearly annoyed. "We're drowning out here," Elliot said, keeping his voice even. "We need help at the desk." Samantha scoffed. "Figure it out. That's what you're paid for." Elliot held his ground. "With all due respect, guests are waiting too long and we're short-staffed. We need more hands or this is going to turn into a disaster." Samantha rolled her eyes, setting her phone down with exaggerated slowness. "You sound like one of those whiny employees who think their job is harder than it actually is," she said, standing up. "Let me tell you something, Eli. Employees like you? Replaceable." Elliot felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay in character. "Then why are we constantly short-staffed?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. Samantha narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms. "Because people these days don't want to work," she said smugly. "They want everything handed to them." Elliot stared at her for a long moment, feeling his anger boil. She actually believed what she was saying. He gave a small nod and turned to leave, his mind already made up. Samantha had no idea who she had just dismissed. But soon she would. That night, as the last guests trickled out and the hotel quieted down, Elliot found himself sitting in the dimly lit staff lounge, watching employees wrap up their shifts. He had seen enough workplace injustice in just a few days to know this wasn't an isolated case. Samantha had created a culture of fear, exhaustion, and exploitation, and everyone had just accepted it as normal. He glanced over at Isla, who sat in the corner, staring at her phone with a frown. She wasn't scrolling mindlessly, she was looking at job listings. That told him everything. Someone as hardworking as her was actively looking for an escape from this toxic environment. "Are you thinking about leaving?" Elliot asked casually, pulling up a chair across from her. She sighed, locking her phone. "I'd be stupid not to. Samantha's never going to change. If she doesn't like you, she cuts your hours. If you complain, she makes sure you regret it. I don't want to live like this forever." Elliot nodded, but before he could say anything else, they heard raised voices from down the hall. He and Isla exchanged glances before stepping out of the lounge. Near the back offices, Nina stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists as Samantha loomed over her. "I don't care if you need the hours," Samantha sneered. "You left 5 minutes early yesterday. That's time theft, and if you don't want to lose more shifts, I suggest you get your priorities straight." Elliot stiffened. Nina's voice was quiet but firm. "I left because my sitter canceled at the last minute. My kid was alone, and I didn't have a choice." Samantha laughed. "Actually, I laughed. Not my problem." Nina's face turned red, but she said nothing. She just nodded and walked away, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the humiliation. Elliot's fists curled at his sides. He had been waiting for the final push, and now he had it. He turned back toward the front desk and saw Marco watching from a distance, shaking his head. Elliot exhaled sharply and made his decision. "Stay here," he muttered to Isla before striding toward the manager's office. Samantha had gotten away with this for too long. That ended tonight. Elliot was done pretending. It was time for Samantha to learn exactly who she had been talking down to. Elliot didn't bother knocking this time. He pushed open Samantha's office door and stepped inside, his presence filling the small space. She barely looked up from her phone, irritation flashing across her face. "I thought I told you to figure it out yourself," she snapped, not even bothering to mask her annoyance. Elliot reached up, tugging off his name tag and placing it deliberately on her desk. When she didn't react, he straightened his posture and let his voice drop into the commanding tone he rarely had to use. "You don't recognize me, do you?" he said coolly. Samantha scoffed, finally looking him in the eye. "Should I?" Elliot pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward her. On it was the official Warren Grand Hotel's website, displaying his name, title, and executive bio. The color drained from Samantha's face. Her mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely uncertain. She started, but Elliot cut her off. I'm Elliot Warren, CEO of this company, and I've spent the last 3 days watching you run this hotel into the ground. She stiffened but tried to regain control. Listen, I don't know what you think you saw, but... Elliot leaned forward, his voice sharp. I saw enough. I saw you abuse your power, cut employee hours out of spite, and humiliate the very people keeping this hotel running. I saw a team of hard-working staff struggling while you sat in here doing nothing. Samantha swallowed hard, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. Managing a hotel isn't easy. Sometimes employees need tough leadership. Elliot's expression darkened. That wasn't leadership. That was control. And as of right now, you're done. Samantha's lips parted, as if she was about to argue, but the finality in his voice made it clear there was no room for discussion. You're firing me? She asked, her voice weaker than before. Effective immediately, Elliot confirmed. Pack your things. You won't be back. For the first time, Samantha had nothing to say. Elliot turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. It was time for the rest of the staff to know that things were finally about to change. As Elliot stepped out of Samantha's office, the entire front desk staff was watching. Word had spread fast. Employees had overheard enough to know something major had just happened. Nina stood frozen near the hallway, while Isla and Marco exchanged wary glances. No one spoke. No one moved. Elliot cleared his throat, making sure everyone could hear him. Samantha is gone, he announced, his voice firm but steady. For a moment, silence. Then Marco let out a low whistle. Nina exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath for hours. A few employees murmured in disbelief, eyes darting towards Samantha's now empty office. Isla just stared at Elliot, searching his expression, as if trying to determine whether this was real. This hotel has been run the wrong way for far too long, Elliot continued. That changes today. He took a step forward, making sure to meet their eyes, not as an outsider, not as an executive behind a desk, but as someone who had worked beside them. No more favoritism, no more cutting hours as punishment, no more overworking the best employees, while the worst get away with doing nothing, he said, his tone sharp but certain. Isla finally spoke. And how do we know this isn't just talk? Elliot didn't hesitate. Because I didn't just watch. I worked here. I saw how hard you push yourselves. I saw how much you care about keeping this place running, even when management failed you. His eyes landed on Isla. Which is why, effective immediately, you're being promoted to assistant manager. She blinked, stunned. What? You've already been doing the job without the title, Elliot said simply. Now you'll have the authority to actually make things better. A few employees exchanged surprised glances, and slowly, relief spread across the room. For the first time in years, it felt like real change was happening. But that's not all, Elliot continued. Pay adjustments are in motion. Hiring starts immediately. No more skeleton crews while you burn yourselves out. And if you have concerns, real concerns, you'll have a direct line to me. No more decisions made by someone who has no idea what's happening on the ground. The shift in the room was palpable. Employees who had once moved with exhaustion now stood with cautious hope. Elliot exhaled, knowing there was still work to be done, but for the first time since walking into this hotel, it felt like they were finally headed in the right direction. The next morning, Elliot arrived at the Warren Grand Miami, this time not in disguise. He walked through the front entrance, dressed not as Eli Walker the trainee, but as Elliot Warren, the CEO. The staff, still adjusting to the previous night's shocking turn of events, stole uncertain glances at him as they went about their morning routines. Isla was already behind the front desk, flipping through a clipboard filled with scheduling notes. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. Didn't think you'd still be around, she said, setting the clipboard down. Elliot leaned against the counter, offering a small nod. It didn't seem right to make promises and then disappear. She studied him for a second, then gave a curt nod. Fair enough. Across the lobby, employees moved with a different kind of energy. The exhaustion was still there, but something had shifted. They weren't just surviving another shift. They were adjusting. waiting to see if things would actually change. Elliot knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild their trust. He had to prove it. By midday, he was back behind the counter, taking orders, helping guests, and assisting with check-ins. He made his way to the housekeeping department, where he found Nina, this time moving with less hesitation. When their eyes met, she didn't look away like before. Instead, she nodded in acknowledgement. Marco, the concierge, crossed his arms as Elliot walked by. "So, what's the plan if the next manager is as bad as the last?" Elliot met his gaze. "Then they won't last long." Marco let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I'll hold you to that." By the end of the day, the atmosphere had lightened, but Elliot knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. "You're different," Isla admitted as they closed up. "Most owners wouldn't have bothered." Elliot shrugged. "Maybe they should." She exhaled, folding her arms. "Just don't disappear when things get comfortable again." He nodded. "I won't." It wasn't perfect yet. There was still work to do, trust to rebuild, and changes to make, but for the first time in a long time, Elliot could see the foundation of something better. And this time, he intended to stay and see it through. As Elliot walked out of the Warren Grand Miami that evening, he took a final glance around the lobby. The hotel wasn't perfect yet. There were still staff shortages to fix, wages to adjust, and a culture of fear to undo. But for the first time, he could feel a real shift in the air. Employees no longer moved with quiet resignation. Instead, there was a sense of cautious optimism, a belief that things could actually change. He had come undercover expecting to confirm a few management issues, but had instead uncovered a toxic system that had gone unchecked for far too long. More importantly, he had seen firsthand just how much his employees had been suffering and how easily that suffering had been ignored from the comfort of a corporate office. Elliot knew that firing one bad manager wasn't enough. This wasn't just about fixing one hotel. It was about ensuring none of his locations ever reached this level of dysfunction again. It was about creating a system where employees weren't just disposable labor, but valued members of the company. As he stepped outside, the warm Miami air hit his face, and for the first time in years, he felt truly connected to his business. He made a silent promise to himself. This wouldn't be the last time he went undercover. Reports and board meetings could only tell him so much, but seeing the reality on the ground, that's what truly mattered. His father had built Warren Grand hotels with integrity. It was time for Elliot to do the same. And this was just the beginning. The story of Elliot Warren's undercover experience at the Warren Grand Miami highlights a powerful lesson about leadership, accountability, and the importance of staying connected to the workforce. Elliot had relied on reports and numbers to gauge the success of his hotels, but he learned that data alone doesn't reveal the true state of a business. Only by stepping into the daily reality of his employees did he uncover the toxic management, exploitation, and mistreatment happening right under his nose. This experience taught him that real leadership isn't about sitting in an office making decisions. It's about understanding the struggles of the people who keep the business running. The biggest takeaway is that a company's success isn't just about profits. It's about the people behind those profits. When employees are overworked, undervalued, and afraid to speak up, even the most prestigious brand will begin to crack. Good leadership fosters respect, fairness, and trust, while bad leadership, like Samantha's, leads to burnout, resentment, and a failing system. Elliot walked away with a newfound commitment to hands-on leadership, because the best way to ensure a business thrives is to listen to and support the people who make it possible.